Alright guys, so what we're going to be talking about on this next slide is some of the pitfalls that we run into when we start, implementing a limp C betting strategy into our own range. Now, when I first show these concepts to students or when I talk about this with other players, something that really comes up is when you're playing lower limits or lower stakes and you play versus a guy who's pretty passive, and limp C betting is just pure gold. It works so well, and we don't really have to deal with too many difficult spots. But when we start moving up in limits and playing guys who have a little bit more of a decorated background here, we find ourselves in some really complicated spots and some pitfalls that we really don't know how to climb out of. And that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit here. The first thing you want to do to kind of comfort yourselves in these spots is make it relatable. And in these limp C bet pots, definitely talking about post-flop opportunities. This is very similar to a min-raise pot where we're talking about continuation betting the flop and barreling turns when the board texture is right for it, or when we pick up equity, so on and so forth. So we're going to be talking about that, and the problem is that people aren't used to barreling off in these limp C betting spots because they're like, I'm wasting chips away, it's a spot where my range just looks weaker in general, so I'm going to be called off more. So many different ideas are flowing through the mind in these spots, so people get a little bit more tentative and a little tight, which is a mistake here, definitely versus players like Regs or players who are being a little bit reluctant to fold their blinds in limp C bet pots. So one of the things you want to start doing right away is start to barrel more turns, and it's a situation where when we're playing versus regs, they're not going to fold that easily. Now, they'll fold sometimes when they have complete air, but more times than not, they're going to float, they're going to play back, they're going to try to trap you, and you could say something like, well, my range is significantly weaker here, but we're going to be talking about our limp C betting strategy in general, and in the sense of that, we're going to be having more value in our range, so you don't have to really worry about that. But some of the things you want to definitely look out for is the same type of things we kind of do when we're in a min-raise pot, which is we want to barrel turns when the card changes the texture of the board. So let's do a quick example. Let's say we have 2-5-9 and the turn is a queen. Well, the queen is a great barrel card because it puts a lot of pressure on 2x, 5x, and even some 9x. It puts a lot of pressure on some straight draws, some gut shots. It puts a lot of pressure on ace-x and king-x. So this is a really good spot to do so in. And it also helps us balance when we have value in these spots. There's nothing better than to be barreling off in this spot when we have value, but when we're playing versus a really good player that knows that we're going to be betting this spot and barreling this spot in general with a lot of air as well. So it's kind of an ideal scenario, and you really want to be balanced in those situations. Second of all is going to be barrel when you pick up equity. Well, you would say, of course, right? But a lot of people don't relate it with your typical min-raise pot. So exactly, flush draws, straight draws, gut shots. When you pick this type of equity up in limp C bet pots, when you're playing versus a guy who isn't necessarily folding to these spots on the flop, you have to be a little bit more. What's the word I'm looking for? A little bit more aggressive on the turns here, and some rivers as well, and just have your ranges very balanced in these spots. Third, you want to be talking about is barrel when you have a hand. And this is kind of goes hand in hand with number one here. When you have a hand, you obviously want to barrel here. Kind of an interesting topic here is when, let's say we have a hand, and the turn card is a really bad turn card in general. We really wouldn't barrel the turn in this spot when we don't have a hand. So it's actually a really good spot to check back some value as well and be a little bit more complex when we're talking about playing versus regs in general, because they know what type of board you're going to be barreling, and when you barrel on a board where you're never doing that with a bluff, well, it's pretty easy to understand that you have a lot of value in your range, so you really want to watch out for that as well. But the main point here is simple. Don't get too tight in these spots. Don't shy away from being aggressive. This is a spot where we've done it a million times in the small blind, and this is a spot you just have to kind of translate it over to your limp C bet pots. Now, obviously, if you're playing versus a guy who is folding so much in these spots, we don't really want to be bluffing all that much, because if they're so tight on the flop, chances are when they call, they're going to have some value in those spots. So you really want to watch it with that, but adjusting versus the right opponent is going to be key to your success at these tables.